This is part one of the lecture, Rise of the New Social Movements. And new social movements are groups of people, often popular groups, not elite groups, operating from the ground up that are, as its name implies, new, that they haven't really had an active role in politics before. And why they're important to study. There are two reasons they're important to study. One is that they are very much a reaction to the extremes of politics on the left and the right, and particularly a reaction to the military dictatorships. And the other reason they're so important is that they help lay the groundwork for the democracies that we see throughout Latin America. So for today's lecture, we're really going to concentrate on the experiences in Brazil and, to a lesser extent, Argentina. And we think about Brazil in the 1970s. It's in the midst of a military dictatorship that began with the coup in 1964. And the coup is there to end populism. And some of the military men say, well, what will follow populism is our rule, and we will rule, for who knows how long, because we're not political. We're going to practice the politics of anti-politics. But that ultimately was deeply problematic because there was no oversight. There was a lot of opportunity for graft and other forms of corruption. So it's important to understand that what the military is trying to get rid of is populism, but populism is the result of, 100 or more years of a certain kind of development. A development that really sees an incredibly successful export economy. Out of those export economies, you get urbanization, some early industrialization. You have the rise of new groups in cities, particularly workers and middle class types. But that export economy, or those export economies in Latin America, while they're quite good at practicing economic liberalism, free trade, capitalism, they have very little interest in political liberalism, in democracy. And it's the call for more participation that leads to the rise of populism, which fails and leads to military dictatorship, or, in the case of Cuba, certainly a Marxist, Leninist communist state. But back to Brazil, we know that the military, although it's a dictatorship and they think they're going to run things for a very long time, they do believe that keeping some aspects of civil society open is important. And so we have a Congress, and we have that's elected. We have governors who are elected. There's some dissent from the media, although there's certainly censorship. And the military is always controlling how far these things will go. Sometimes it's violence or the threat of violence. It's using the thing caçado to take away people's political rights. I mentioned in the lecture on bureaucratic authoritarianism that the Brazilian military was very legalistic. They would issue things called institutional acts to change the rules of the game. So if they felt the opposition was doing too well in elections and too many opposition congressmen being elected, they'd make it harder for that to happen. But the military, try as it might, couldn't control what was going on. And the absence of powerful political institutions before 1964, along with the politics of anti-politics, when I say there were weak political institutions, there weren't great political parties, and there wasn't a tremendously vibrant civil society. There wasn't much of a democracy. It was a very weak democracy. All those things combined to open the door to new actors. And then the international context really matters. And from the vantage point of the 21st century, saying air travel expanded and telecommunications expanded, those things sound trite. But they really were different. And international air travel became much more common in the 1960s and 70s than it had been before. It was very much an elite, high-level elite thing. And, radio and movies and television and long-distance telephony, right, using the phone, that all became more accessible. And so what that meant is that in Latin America, and Brazil, Argentina, Chile are good examples, the opposition became more worldly, more cosmopolitan. People went into exile in Paris and London, in San Francisco and Berkeley and Madison, Wisconsin, and Cambridge and Boston, and they came in contact with lots of new ideas. And they were able to communicate those ideas by going back to their countries at times, but also, on the telephone and other ways. Well, who are these new actors? Well, there are three we're going to look at. And the first one, if you're paying attention, you say, wow, how is the church a new actor? Wasn't the church involved in the conquest? Well, of course. But we're talking about new aspects or new components of the church, and we'll get to that in a little bit. The second group is the women's movement. Now that one should be pretty clear. That's new. There hasn't, with weak democracies, there hasn't been a big suffrage movement because voting was so unimportant in most of Latin America. But the women's movement really is a new actor in Brazil and elsewhere. The workers' movement. Well, workers have been involved in politics, but we're talking about new labor, groups coming out of new industries, particularly automobiles, and who weren't tied to the old populists or the communists. They really are very new. Well, let's look at the church first. And what we think of as new in the church is liberation theology. Liberation theology called for the church to put the gospel in practice on earth. In other words, quite literally, how would Jesus act? What would Jesus's take be on the poverty in Latin America versus the wealth of a few? And this question of putting the gospel in practice reflected long-standing tensions in the church. That the church formally represented the crown and the papacy, but there were parish priests who were always trying to protect Indians and the poor. And we can see that even in the Mexican independence struggle with Hidalgo and Morelos. But the option for the poor, which is what they call this in liberation theology, kind of wins the day in 1968 at a conference of the bishops of Latin America in Medellin, Colombia. Now, the bishops, if you're completely unfamiliar with the Catholic Church, it's very hierarchical, right, with the Pope on top. But the Pope is a priest, and the Pope is a bishop, and the Pope is an archbishop, and the Pope is a cardinal. So it's how it works. So there were cardinals and archbishops and bishops at this meeting, and in Latin America, the Pope was not there. The Pope was not from Latin America then. And these people in the hierarchy said, we are going to always side with the poor. Now, part of the decision to do this was due to the changes that the church was facing, particularly in the post-World War II period. And in response to those changes, there were a series of papal encyclicals that changed how the church interacted with its parishioners, particularly Vatican II. And this brought a real dialogue between the average church-going person and the hierarchy. Vatican II did things throughout the world where now Mass was not said in Latin, it was said in the local language or whatever language the parishioners wanted. And there was just a kind of opening up that lay people could say Mass. It was a somewhat, the first steps of democratizing the church. And that's all in the early 1960s. And that's worldwide, but it certainly influences what goes on in Brazil. Moreover, the church in Brazil became highly politicized in reaction to the dictatorship. In the Northeast, a bishop named Dom Helder da Câmara worked closely with peasant leagues before the dictatorship, and after it, he worked to protect the poor, to shield them from the most extreme excesses of the regime. The archbishop in Sao Paulo, who becomes a cardinal, right? So that's the Pope and then the College of Cardinals, so an incredibly high-ranking prelate, Dom Paulo Evaristo Arns, publicly condemned the military. He even challenged the right of military men who had tortured people to receive communion. This is a pretty significant act. And he ran a kind of underground railroad for torture victims. Most torture victims in Brazil were not killed. And he tried to interview them and get as much information on what happened. I mean, not him personally, but the church, and to give people support. And they collected all this information, and it's thousands and thousands of pages of interviews, and there are several copies of this distributed throughout the world. And then in Brazil, right after the dictatorship ended, they published them as Brasil Nunca Mais, Brazil Never Again. It was translated in English as Torture in Brazil. So you can see the church, the highest ranking church officials are involved in this. But the church was also facing other kinds of challenges that encouraged it to play this role, to be more active in the lives of everyday people. Beginning in the post-World War II period, the Catholic Church in Brazil and elsewhere in Latin America faced a real challenge from evangelical Protestants, mostly U.S.-based, who were really reaching out into poor neighborhoods, into new neighborhoods. Now, the thing about the Catholic Church is it's technically geographically organized into parishes. Now, you can go to any parish you want, but in the context of rapid urban growth, the growth of megacities, Mexico City, Santiago, Lima, Sao Paulo, Rio, others in Brazil, the parishes couldn't keep up, and these new evangelical churches did. So given Vatican II, that opened up how a church could work, the Catholic Church in Brazil and elsewhere in Latin America created something called ecclesiastical base communities, Comunidades Eclesiais de Base, SEBIs. Now, what was a SEBI? A SEBI was an informal church, but it was approved by the formal Catholic Church. So in a new neighborhood, in the periphery, in a slum, you could have this informal church tied to the formal Catholic Church. But almost more significantly, it was a place where politics and religion intersected. And when more left-wing opposition groups to the dictatorship, new groups, mostly tied to New Labor, were organizing, they had close ties to the liberation theologians, and they could use these ecclesiastical-based communities as places to organize. And that kind of worked multiple ways. So you had labor organizing going on in this sort of church, but that also sent a message to recent arrivals from the rural sector, I mean, the people who were in the periphery and the slums of these new cities, that these labor guys are not dangerous communists. My God, they work closely with the church. So it was a way in which the church tied in with new political actors, and new political actors, in this case labor, were seen as not radical because they had close ties with the church itself.